Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Settle in, get cozy, maybe dim the lights a little. Tonight, we're going to dive into one of those delightfully unsettling historical rabbit holes that makes you wonder what exactly was going on in people's minds back then. No need for jump scares here, just a slow, gentle drift into the past, specifically ancient Rome, and a little thing called the Bacchanalia. It's got all the makings of a good bedtime story: secret rituals, nervous senators, and a healthy dose of moral panic. So let's begin with the night the Roman Senate truly panicked about a god of wine and revelry. Imagine, if you will, the bustling, sun-drenched streets of Rome in the early 2nd century BCE. It's all very stoic, very orderly, very Roman. You've got your toga-clad citizens, your senators pontificating in the forum, your legions marching with impeccable discipline. Everything, on the surface, is about control, order, and the gravitas of Roman tradition. But, as with all good stories, beneath that very polished veneer, something a little un-Roman was brewing, and it involved Bacchus. Now, Bacchus, or Dionysus as the Greeks knew him, was never exactly a god of moderation. He was the god of wine, sure, but also of ecstasy, ritual madness, fertility, and general letting loose. Not exactly the kind of deity you'd expect the buttoned-up Roman elite to embrace with open arms, or, well, any arms. His cults, imported from the Greek world, had a tendency to involve, well, parties. And these weren't your Aunt Mildred's polite wine and cheese gatherings. We're talking about ecstatic dancing, music, and an atmosphere that encouraged, shall we say, a complete shedding of inhibitions. For a long time, the Roman authorities mostly tolerated these foreign cults, provided they kept to themselves and didn't cause too much fuss. After all, Rome was a melting pot, and they were generally pretty pragmatic about other people's gods. Live and let live as long as you pay your taxes and don't openly question Roman dominance. But the cult of Bacchus, or the Bacchanalia as its rites were known, was different. It started small, as most things do, a little whisper here, a quiet gathering there. Initially, these rites were, at least ostensibly, exclusively for women. They were held 3 times a year, during the day, and were meant to be a kind of private, almost domestic affair. Very prim and proper, or as prim and proper as you can get when you're celebrating a god of uninhibited revelry. The idea was that these women, under the influence of Bacchus, would engage in these frenzied dances and rituals, presumably for fertility or some other such traditional purpose. And for a while, it seemed to tick along without much incident. But then, as always happens when something is a little too secretive and a little too intriguing, things started to change. The cult began to expand, and the exclusivity of women-only rites started to erode. Men started joining, and not just a few curious fellows, but soon the cult was open to anyone, regardless of age or gender. And this, my friends, is where Rome started to get a little twitchy, because when you open up a secret society dedicated to ecstatic revelry to everyone, especially in a society as rigidly structured as Rome, you're practically asking for trouble. The frequency of the rites also increased, going from 3 times a year during the day to 5 times a month, and crucially, they started taking place at night. Now, if you're a Roman senator sitting in your toga, sipping your watered-down wine, and hear whispers of nocturnal gatherings 5 times a month involving men and women, all dedicated to a god of wild abandon, well, your alarm bells are probably starting to clang a little, loudly. The secrecy surrounding these new, expanded bacchanalia was a huge red flag for the Roman authorities. Roman society, remember, valued public display and open rituals. Anything hidden, anything done in the shadows, was immediately suspect. It suggested conspiracy, sedition, or at the very least, a serious lack of respect for traditional Roman values, which, let's be honest, were mostly about keeping things very ordered. The story of how the Senate finally found out about the true extent of the Bacchanalia is, as these things often are, rather dramatic. It all began with a young man named Publius Abutius. He was, by all accounts, a fairly average Roman youth living with his mother, Hispala Ficenia, and her stepfather. His father had died, and her stepfather, by a previous marriage, had a daughter named Pacula Aeneia, and Pacula Aeneia was apparently a rather enthusiastic devotee of Bacchus. Now, Pacula Aeneia was a priestess of the Bacchanalia, and she was the one who, according to Livy, one of our primary sources, really amplified the cult's practices. She was apparently quite the innovator, introducing the nocturnal rites and changing the rules to allow men to participate. She also, it seems, was a bit of a proselytizer. Her son, Minius Serini, was also deeply involved. The stage is set then. Publius Abutius, our protagonist, was engaged to a very respectable young woman. His mother, Hispala Ficenia, was worried. Her husband, Abutius's stepfather, had told her that he intended to initiate Publius into the Bacchanalia, and this, for Hispala, was a step too far. She was a traditional Roman woman, and the idea of her son getting involved in these increasingly infamous nighttime rituals filled her with dread. She tried to dissuade her husband, but he was insistent. So she turned to her son, Publius. She pleaded with him, telling him not to go, explaining the rumors she'd heard about the depravity and the illicit activities that supposedly went on during these rites. She painted a picture of debauchery and danger, hoping to scare him away. And it worked, to a certain extent. Publius was indeed scared. But Publius, being a good Roman son, was in a bit of a bind. How do you refuse your stepfather, especially when he's holding the purse strings? Remember, Publius was an orphan in a sense, reliant on his stepfather's goodwill. So he stalled. He made excuses, saying he was unwell, hoping to buy himself some time. His stepfather, however, was not easily fooled. He started to suspect that Hispala had put him up to it. The situation at home became tense. Hispala, fearing for her son's safety and her own, eventually fled. She sought refuge with a former freedwoman, a woman named Ficenia, who had once been her own slave. Ficenia, perhaps feeling a sense of loyalty or simply recognizing the gravity of the situation, advised Hispala to seek out Lucius Postumius Albinus. And who was Lucius Postumius Albinus? Why, he was one of the consuls, one of the most powerful men in Rome. Of course he was. So Hispala, a frantic mother, approaches a consul with a tale of secret cults, nocturnal orgies, and her son's impending initiation. Now, most consuls might dismiss such a story as the ramblings of an overprotective mother, but Postumius, for whatever reason, decided to listen. Perhaps he'd already heard whispers, perhaps he had a nose for trouble, or perhaps, and this is entirely plausible, the sheer Romanness of the situation, a mother desperate to protect her son from a foreign, un-Roman influence, struck a chord. He listened patiently as Hispala recounted her story, growing increasingly alarmed as she described the cult's practices. She spoke of how the rites had originally been for women, but then men had been admitted. She described the drinking, the feasting, the wild music, and the eventual descent into what she believed was widespread sexual promiscuity and criminal activity. She even claimed that false testimonies were extracted under duress and that murders occurred within the cult. It was, in short, a consul's worst nightmare. But Hispala didn't just spill the beans to Postumius. She insisted on telling her story under certain conditions. She wanted a guarantee that no harm would come to her or her son. She feared the powerful reach of the cult members, knowing that many influential people, perhaps even senators, were involved. Postumius, recognizing the seriousness of her request and the potential implications, took her concerns very seriously. He consulted with his mother-in-law, a venerable matron, and then with the Senate itself. The Senate, upon hearing Postumius's summary of Hispala's account, went into full-blown panic mode. This wasn't just a few people worshipping a foreign god. This was a conspiracy, a hidden organization that threatened the very fabric of Roman society. Remember, Rome was still reeling from the Hannibalic Wars, and the idea of internal subversion, of a secret society undermining traditional values, was absolutely terrifying. They envisioned secret plots, assassinations, rebellions, all brewing under the cover of night and wine-fueled frenzy. They imagined families torn apart, loyalties subverted, and the youth of Rome corrupted. It was everything that a proper Roman detested: disorder, secrecy, and unbridled emotion. So the Senate, in a move that demonstrated how seriously they took this issue, issued a decree, a Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalia, which essentially declared war on the cult of Bacchus. Postumius, with the full backing of the Senate, began his investigation. He brought in Publius Abutius and questioned him. Publius confirmed his mother's story, adding his own details about the pressure he'd been under and his fears. The consul then had to decide how to proceed. This was not a minor affair. This was an investigation that would reach into the heart of Roman society, and it required careful handling. The initial phase of the investigation was conducted in secret because the Senate, in its infinite wisdom, was convinced that if the members of the cult found out they were being investigated, they would flee or, worse, retaliate. So Postumius and his fellow consul, Spurius Postumius Albinus, no relation, just a coincidence of names, worked quietly, gathering intelligence.
So, we've left the incense-heavy temples of Babylon behind, and we're drifting forward in time, landing softly in the marbled halls of the 16th and 17th centuries. We're moving from a culture that used ritual to connect with the gods to a culture that used marriage to collect real estate. And no one, and I mean no one, was better at collecting real estate, or worse at biological diversity, than the House of Habsburg. You've probably seen the portraits. They're hanging in the Prado or the Kunsthistorisches Museum, and they all have that look. It's a look that says, I own half the known world, but I find it physically difficult to chew a piece of toast. This was the Habsburg jaw, or more scientifically, mandibular prognathism. It's what happens when your family tree doesn't have any branches and is instead just a very long, very sad pole. The Habsburgs had a motto, let others wage war, thou, happy Austria, marry. And marry they did. They married their cousins, their nieces, and their second cousins twice removed, until the family reunions were basically just a mirror image of the dinner table. They did this because they were obsessed with purity. They didn't want their lands, Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, chunks of Italy, leaking out to other families. But in their quest to keep the bloodline pure, they accidentally turned it into a bit of a genetic cul-de-sac. Let's talk about the poster child for this era of dynastic awkwardness, Charles II of Spain. Now, poor Charles is often described by historians as unfortunate, which is a very polite way of saying he was a walking medical miracle. He was the son of Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, who were uncle and niece. Because of centuries of previous inbreeding, Charles was actually more inbred than if his parents had been siblings. His genetic coefficient was off the charts. Charles was born in 1661, and from the moment he arrived, it was clear that things were a bit wonky. He didn't speak until he was 4, he didn't walk until he was 8, and that famous jaw? In Charles, it reached its final form. His lower jaw protruded so far that his upper and lower teeth couldn't meet. He couldn't chew his food properly, which led to chronic digestive issues. He was also known to drool quite a bit, which is a tough look when you're supposed to be the most powerful man in Christendom. The court of Madrid at this time was a strange, silent place. It was obsessed with etiquette. There were rules for how many steps you could take towards the king and who was allowed to touch his water glass. And in the middle of all this rigid golden splendor was Charles, a man who spent most of his time being exorcised because the court doctors were convinced his physical ailments were the result of sorcery. Yes, they actually called him El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, because surely the reason the king is sickly and has a difficult time focusing isn't the 300 years of marrying his own relatives. No, it must be a malicious hex cast by a rival. It's a classic case of historical gaslighting. It's not the DNA, Charles. It's definitely a ghost. The daily life of Charles II was a slow-motion tragedy. He was treated like a fragile glass doll. He wasn't allowed to study too hard because the doctors thought the mental strain would break him. He wasn't allowed to play too roughly. He mostly just wandered the palace, playing with dwarfs and pets, while his mother and various juntas actually ran the crumbling Spanish Empire. And yet, there's something almost sweet about him in the records. He wasn't a tyrant, he wasn't cruel, he was just a very tired, very sick man who was born into a job he could never possibly do. He was married twice, once to Marie Louise of Orleans and once to Maria Anna of Neuburg, but unsurprisingly, he couldn't produce an heir. The accounts of his first marriage are particularly melancholy. Marie Louise was a vibrant French princess who was understandably horrified to find herself married to a man who struggled to hold a conversation and looked like a melting wax sculpture. But over time, they reportedly developed a genuine, quiet affection for each other. When she died, Charles was devastated. It was one of the few times he showed a spark of deep human emotion. But the machinery of state doesn't care about grief. They immediately married him off again to Maria Anna, who was much more formidable character. She spent most of her time arguing with Charles's mother and trying to influence the succession, while Charles's health continued to spiral. By the end of his life, Charles was a wreck. He suffered from hallucinations, seizures, and a laundry list of other ailments. He died at the age of 38, looking like an old man. When the doctors performed an autopsy, which was a grisly public affair back then, they claimed his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, and his head was full of water. It's a hyperbolic description, of course, but it captures the vibe. Charles II was the physical embodiment of a dynasty that had simply run out of steam. But the Habsburgs weren't the only ones playing this game. Let's float over to the chilly, opulent courts of Russia, where the Romanovs were dealing with their own version of genetic destiny. While the Habsburgs had the jaw, the Romanovs eventually had the royal malady, hemophilia. Now, this didn't start with them. It started with Queen Victoria of England, the grandmother of Europe. Victoria was a carrier of the gene, and because she married her children off to every royal house from Spain to Prussia, she effectively seeded the continent with a ticking biological bomb. In Russia, this bomb went off in the form of Alexei Nikolaevich, the only son of Tsar Nicholas II. He was the long-awaited heir, the sunbeam of the family. But he was born with hemophilia, meaning even a small bruise could lead to internal bleeding that lasted for days, causing him agonizing pain. This is where the story shifts from genetically awkward to deeply dysfunctional. Because the Tsar and the Tsarina were so desperate to keep their son's illness a secret, they became increasingly isolated. They didn't want the Russian public to know the heir to the throne was broken. This isolation created a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped a man who is the MVP of weird historical side characters, Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was a Siberian monk who claimed to have healing powers. Whether through hypnosis, sheer charisma, or just by telling the doctors to stop giving the boy aspirin, which we now know thins the blood and makes hemophilia worse, Rasputin seemed to be the only one who could stop Alexei's bleeding. Imagine the scene. A dark, velvet-draped room in the Winter Palace. A young boy is screaming in pain. The most powerful couple in Russia are on their knees, weeping, and in walks this unwashed, wild-eyed monk from the wilderness who whispers to the child and somehow makes the pain stop. It's no wonder Tsarina Alexandra thought he was a saint sent by God. But the Russian nobility, they just saw a dirty peasant whispering in the empress's ear. This led to a spiral of rumors, scandals, and eventually the complete collapse of the monarchy. All because a gene didn't copy itself correctly in a nursery in London decades ago. It's a strange butterfly effect kind of tragedy. A tiny hiccup in a protein led to the end of a 300-year-old empire. There's a common thread here, whether we're looking at the sagging jaw of Charles II or the bruised joints of Alexei Romanov. These people were victims of their own status. They were told they were superior, chosen by God, and physically better than the common folk. But the irony is that the common folk, with their diverse gene pools and lack of cousin marriages, were infinitely more robust. The peasants in the field might have been poor, but they usually could chew their bread, and their blood clotted when they scraped a knee. The highest in the land were often the most fragile. It makes you wonder about the mindset of these royals. Did they look in the mirror and think, yes, this is what greatness looks like, or did there be a quiet, nagging fear that they were fading away? We have letters from some of these figures where they complain about their health with a sort of weary resignation. They didn't see it as a genetic failing. They saw it as a heavy crown they were forced to wear. And as we settle deeper into the night, let's move away from the medical charts and look at the more personality-driven disasters. Because while genes can make you sickly, it takes a special kind of upbringing to make you truly, spectacularly dysfunctional. Next, we're going to look at the Mad King Ludwig II of Bavaria. He wasn't a victim of inbreeding in the same way Charles II was, but he was certainly a victim of his own imagination. He's the man who built the fairy tale castles you see in Disney movies, but he did it while slowly losing his grip on reality and his kingdom's finances. He's the patron saint of people who would rather live in a dream than deal with a cabinet meeting. So, take a deep.
Moving on from the genetic dead end of the Spanish Habsburgs, we should probably take a slow, meandering carriage ride north, across the Pyrenees, into the glittering, gold-leafed nightmare that was the French court at Versailles. If Charles II lived in a gilded morgue, the French royals lived in a gilded pressure cooker. Specifically, let's talk about the Sun King, Louis XIV, and his brother, Philippe, the Duke of Orleans. It was a sibling dynamic that was as dysfunctional as it was fabulously dressed. Now, when you think of Louis XIV, you probably think of the red-heeled shoes, the massive wigs that looked like they belonged on a prize-winning poodle, and the absolute power. He was the center of the universe, the sun, and everyone else was just a tiny, shivering planet revolving around him. But to make sure he stayed the sun, Louis had to make sure his younger brother, Philippe, stayed, well, a moon at best. The French monarchy had a bit of a trauma-informed history with younger brothers starting civil wars. To prevent this, Louis's mother and Cardinal Mazarin decided on a very specific parenting strategy for Philippe. They encouraged him to be as unkingly as possible. While Louis was being taught how to lead armies and stare down ambassadors, Philippe was encouraged to dress up in girls' clothes, play with ribbons, and obsess over jewelry. The goal was to make him so focused on his own reflection that he'd never think about the throne. And in a rare win for 17th century psychology, it worked perfectly. Philippe grew up to be Monsieur, a man who was arguably the most flamboyant person in a century that was already defined by being too much. Philippe was fascinating. He was a brave soldier, actually a much better military commander than Louis, which annoyed the king to no end. But he would return from the battlefield and immediately worry that the sun had ruined his complexion. He would lead a cavalry charge in the morning and spend the evening debating the merits of different scented powders. He was openly, notoriously gay in an era where that was supposed to be a one-way ticket to a very dark cell. But because he was the king's brother, he just got to be the trendsetter for the entire court. But living at Versailles wasn't all just satin and gossip. It was actually, by modern standards, a sensory horror show. Imagine the most beautiful building you've ever seen, filled with the most beautiful people in Europe, and then imagine that nobody has showered in 3 weeks. Louis XIV famously hated baths. He believed that water opened the pores to disease, so he mostly just wiped his face with a damp cloth soaked in alcohol and changed his linen shirt several times a day. If you were standing near the king, you weren't smelling royalty. You were smelling sweat, old wine, and the heavy, cloying scent of 1,000 different perfumes trying to cover it up. The palace itself was no better. It was a masterpiece of architecture, but they forgot to include enough bathrooms. With thousands of nobles living there, people would frequently handle their business in the hallways, behind curtains, or in the gardens. It was a place of extreme elegance and extreme filth, where a duchess might be wearing a dress that cost more than a village while stepping over something truly unspeakable in the corridor. Louis used this environment to control his nobles. He turned life into a series of absurd, high-stakes rituals. The most coveted job in France wasn't being a general or a minister. It was the groom of the stool, the guy who got to sit with the king while he was on the toilet. People would bribe, fight, and ruin their reputations just for the chance to hold the king's shirt while he got dressed in the morning. If you weren't at the lever, the morning rising ceremony, or the coucher, the bedtime ceremony, you basically didn't exist. Louis would look around and say, "I do not see him," which was the 17th century version of being canceled. It was a slow, exhausting game of musical chairs that lasted for 50 years. But let's drift away from the perfume and the filth of France and float toward a much colder, much more eccentric climate. Let's talk about the Romanovs in Russia, specifically the Empress Elizabeth Petrovna. If Louis XIV was obsessed with ritual, Elizabeth was obsessed with the sheer, chaotic theater of power. Part 4. The Empress Who Hated Baldness and Bedrooms. Elizabeth Petrovna was the daughter of Peter the Great, and she inherited all of her father's energy, but none of his interest in building ships. She was beautiful, she knew it, and she made it everyone else's problem. She famously owned 15,000 dresses and reportedly never wore the same one twice. She would change her outfit 2 or 3 times a night, because why not? When you're the empress of all the Russias, the laundry bill is someone else's concern. Elizabeth had a very specific kind of vanity. She was particularly proud of her hair. One time, she had a bit of a disaster with some hair dye, because even empresses have bad hair days, and she had to shave her head. Now, a normal person might wear a hat. Elizabeth, however, decided that if she had to be bald, everyone had to be bald. She issued an imperial decree ordering all the ladies of the court to shave their heads and wear matching scratchy black wigs until her own hair grew back. It's that kind of, if I'm going down, I'm taking you with me energy that really defines the Romanovs. She was deeply, profoundly paranoid. She didn't like sleeping in the same room 2 nights in a row because she was terrified of being assassinated in her bed. So every night, she would wander through the palace, followed by a confused entourage, until she found a random sofa or a different bedroom that felt safe. Imagine being a servant and just finding the Empress of Russia asleep in your break room because she had a bad vibe about her own suite. Elizabeth's court was a whirlwind of balls, masquerades, and what she called metamorphosis balls. At these parties, the men had to dress as women and the women had to dress as men. Elizabeth loved this because she had great legs and looked fantastic in a men's military uniform, whereas the men, large, bearded Russian nobles, looked absolutely ridiculous in silk gowns and hooped skirts. They would stumble over their trains and pop out of their bodices, while Elizabeth glided around, looking better than all of them. It was a gentle, slow-motion humiliation that kept everyone in their place. But beneath the dresses and the dancing, there was a deep underlying sadness to the Romanov line. Elizabeth never married, and her choice of heir was her nephew, Peter III, a man who was, to put it mildly, not quite ready for the job. Peter III was obsessed with toy soldiers, not in a "I'm a hobbyist" kind of way, but in a "I'm an adult emperor who spends all day playing with dolls" kind of way. He once held a full military funeral for a rat because the rat had chewed the head off one of his wax soldiers. He had the rat court-martialed and executed by hanging. This was the man who was supposed to run Russia. His wife, a minor German princess who would eventually become Catherine the Great, spent her wedding night watching him play with toy soldiers in their bed. You can almost hear the sigh she must have let out, realizing that if Russia was going to be a superpower, she was going to have to do it herself. And that's the thing about these dynasties. They spent so much time trying to preserve their power, their blood, and their secrets that they often ended up producing people who were more interested in rats or ribbons than in ruling. It's a long, slow decline from the conquering heroes of the past to the eccentric, sickly, and overwhelmed royals who ended up haunting the hallways of their own palaces. Actually, looking back at our clock, we've still got quite a way to go before the sun rises on our historical tour. Let's pick up right where we left off with the Romanovs and then drift through the rest of our dynastic disasters until the story is complete. The thing about Elizabeth Petrovna's court was that it was governed by a very specific kind of logic, one where the empress's whims were the only law of physics that mattered. She was so obsessed with her own image that she actually banned anyone else from wearing the same hair ornaments or fabric patterns as her. If a lady-in-waiting showed up in a lace that Elizabeth liked, that lady might find herself sent home in tears, or worse, having that lace physically cut off her dress by the Empress's own scissors. It was a high-stakes game of who wore it best, where losing meant social exile. But even more bizarre than her metamorphosis balls was her relationship with time. Elizabeth was a chronic insomniac. Because she was terrified of being murdered in her sleep, a very valid fear in 18th century Russia, to be fair, she basically tried to turn night into day. The entire court was forced to stay awake with her. They would dance, gamble, and eat heavy Russian meals at 3 in the morning, their eyes drooping, their powdered wigs tilting precariously, all while Elizabeth remained vibrant and alert. When she finally did feel sleepy, she wouldn't go to her bed. As I mentioned, she'd just wander. She would have her servants carry her to different rooms, sometimes sleeping in a servant's quarters or a small sitting room, convinced that the assassins wouldn't think to look for the Empress of Russia on a random velvet chaise longue in the laundry wing. It's a very tiring way to live, both for her and for the poor souls who had to carry the pillows. Eventually, the 15,000 dresses and the 3 a.m. dinners came to an end. When Elizabeth died in 1762, she left behind a Russia that was more European than ever, but also a successor, Peter III, who was, well, he was the guy with the rat-hanging hobby. His reign lasted only 6 months before his wife, Catherine, decided she'd had quite enough of the toy soldiers and the rat funerals. She staged a coup. Peter accidentally died in a scuffle shortly after, and Catherine began her own long, much more competent, but equally dramatic reign. Let's float away from the frozen palaces of St. Petersburg now. Let's drift toward England, where the tragedy wasn't a lack of competence, but a mind that simply decided to go on its own journey. Part 5. The King, the Trees, and the Purple Urine. When people talk about King George III, they usually go straight to the madness. They think of the guy from Hamilton, or the movie where he talks to an oak tree because he thinks it's the King of Prussia. But the reality of George's life was much more domestic, much more repetitive, and in a way, much more boring, which for our purposes tonight is perfect. George III was actually a very unroyal royal. He was nicknamed Farmer George because he genuinely loved agriculture. He wrote articles for farming magazines under a pseudonym. He was obsessed with the price of grain and the proper way to rotate crops. He was the first Hanoverian king who actually was born in England and spoke English as his first language, and he took his job very, very seriously. He was a family man, devoted to his wife, Queen Charlotte, and their 15, yes, 15 children. But then the episode started. Modern historians and doctors have debated whether it was porphyria or bipolar disorder, but whatever it was, it turned the king's orderly life into a nightmare. During his bouts of illness, George would talk for hours, sometimes 24 hours straight, until his voice was a hoarse whisper and he was foaming at the mouth. He would repeat the same phrases over and over, his mind caught in a loop like a scratched record. The treatments were arguably worse than the disease. Because the doctors of the 18th century didn't understand mental health, they treated him like a dangerous animal. They put him in a straitjacket. They used blistering, which involved applying caustic chemicals to his skin to cause painful blisters, believing this would draw out the bad humors. They forced him to take powerful emetics to make him vomit. Imagine being the most powerful man in the British Empire, and you're being held down by doctors who are burning your legs and forcing you to throw up, all while you're trying to explain to them that the tree in the garden is actually a Prussian diplomat. One of the strangest symptoms, which points toward the porphyria theory, was that his urine would occasionally turn a deep, dark purple or blue. The royal doctors would spend hours staring at the king's chamber pot, trying to divine the future of the British Empire from the color of his pee. It's a very strange image, the highest minds in the land gathered in a circle, debating the political implications of a purple puddle. In his later years, George became a ghost in his own palace. He went blind, he went deaf, and he lived in a state of permanent madness at Windsor Castle. He grew a long, white King Lear beard and would spend his days playing the harpsichord and talking to people who had been dead for decades. He didn't even know he had won the Napoleonic Wars. He didn't know his wife had died. He was just a gentle, old, confused man wandering the halls in a purple dressing gown, playing Handel to an empty room. Part 6. The Diamond-Encrusted Isolation of CXI. Finally, let's travel to the Far East, to the Forbidden City in Beijing, where the Qing dynasty was performing its own slow, elaborate disappearing act. If the European courts were dysfunctional, the Chinese imperial court was an absolute masterclass in suffocating tradition. At the center of it all was the Empress Dowager CXI. She started as a low-ranking concubine and ended up ruling China for nearly 50 decades. But her power was held within a world that was almost entirely cut off from reality. In the Forbidden City, there were thousands of eunuchs whose entire lives were dedicated to the Empress's comfort. Every meal she ate consisted of 150 different dishes. She would take a few bites of 2 or 3, and the rest would be thrown away or given to the servants. She had a specialized nail care team because her nails were several inches long, protected by gold and jade guards to show that she had never done a day of labor in her life. CXI was obsessed with her gardens and her pets. She had a particular fondness for Pekingese dogs who had their own eunuchs to look after them. While the rest of the world was industrializing, building steamships and telegraph lines, CXI was spending the Chinese Navy's budget on a literal marble boat, a stationary pavilion in the shape of a ship in the middle of a lake. It was beautiful, it was expensive, and in the face of modern warfare, it was completely useless. She lived in a world of absolute silence and rigid ceremony. When she moved through the palace, people had to drop to their knees and look at the ground. She was surrounded by beauty, by silk and jade and ancient poetry, but she was also surrounded by a crumbling empire that she didn't quite understand. Her own nephew, the Guangxu emperor, tried to modernize China. He wanted to change the education system, the military, the government. CXI's response was she had him placed under house arrest on a small island in the middle of the palace grounds. He spent the rest of his life as a prisoner in his own home, staring at the walls, while her aunt continued to order 150 dishes for lunch every day. The end of the Qing dynasty was much like the end of the Spanish Habsburgs or the Romanovs. It was a collapse brought on by an obsession with the past and a refusal to see the present. When CXI died in 1908, the empire she had held together through sheer force of will lasted only 3 more years. And so we've reached the end of our journey through the weird, the dark, and the tragically dysfunctional lives of the world's elites. From the wine-soaked panics of Rome to the purple urine of England and the marble boats of China, history is rarely about the grand victories we see in textbooks. More often, it's about people, very flawed, often very sickly, and usually very overwhelmed people, trying to hold on to power in a world that is moving much too fast for them. The lights are low, the stories are told, and the past is tucked away for another night. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next chapter.